Hi everybody, this is an ongoing series examining the dungeon design in Zelda games. We've already taken a look at all of Ocarina of Time's dungeons, so go check that out if you'd like. Otherwise, let's hop into Majora's Mask. The first and most important thing to know before jumping into Majora's Mask is that there was a clear decision here as far as accessibility goes. By that I mean that since this is Link's second adventure on the N64, the developers seemed intent on making this game much more difficult from the get-go than Ocarina of Time was. And that makes sense. Link is an accomplished hero already, and since we have gone through an entire adventure with Link, the game takes a different approach with its progression and story setting as well. It overturns the entire structure of the game in order to subvert our expectations as Zelda players, and it does it all masterfully. Because of this, there's a bit to talk about before the actual dungeon, so if you don't care about that context, you can skip ahead to the progression section of the video. But otherwise, stick around because I feel like this information is important to understanding what makes this game tick. Let's compare the opening of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Nightmare aside, when Link wakes up, he's greeted by friends and has to get a sword and shield before heading over to the first dungeon. It's a simple to-do list, all of which takes place in his peaceful hometown of Kokiri Forest. It's calm and has a very lighthearted and fun vibe, but the childlike wondrous feel of this section matches the game's story and character arc for Link. In fact, this entire setup is meant to get us as the player acquainted with our protagonist Link and his relationship with the world around him. Now, in Majora's Mask, it's assumed that we already know this version of Link, so the game doesn't need to waste any time to set that up. Instead, it focuses on its story and world building immediately. We don't need to learn about Link as a character, so we can be thrown into this conflict immediately, as Link is essentially mugged and has to pursue the Skull Kid through the Lost Woods. Then we get this trip, and Skull Kid curses us. Link's scream when he first sees his reflection after being transformed into a Deku Scrub is just heartbreaking. Further, let's compare how Link meets his companion. When we meet Navi, she is sent by the Deku Tree to be Link's companion. They are a duo by destiny, and they both accept that. Navi's always happy to help, and always does her best to provide you with the best intel, even if at times she steers you in the right direction a bit too much. Tattle, however, is actually one of the villain's companions initially, but she gets separated from her brother because she spends too much time punching Link in the face. She only allies herself with Link out of necessity, so when you ask her for help with things, her replies typically are more sassy and less helpful. Her motivation is just to reunite with her brother, and so when she steers you in the right direction with hints, it's only because of her own selfish motivations, not because she actually cares about helping you. At first, that is. Heck, even her apology comes off as super insincere. After we go through this short tutorial section where we learn how to use Deku Link's abilities, we meet the happy mask salesman, who sets up our goal for the game. He explains that he has also had something stolen from him by the Skull Kid, that being the titular Majora's Mask itself. You strike up a deal. If you can retrieve your ocarina from Skull Kid and the stolen mask, the happy mask salesman will help you return to your Hylian form. We are told that he's leaving town in 3 days, however, so we have to make sure that we complete this before the 3 days are up. There's another reason for our 3-day time limit. The moon is going to crash and destroy everything. Great! And in the meantime, it hangs over us as a constant reminder of this threat. Now I need to quickly address something about this section of the game because there is still a lot to do before the actual dungeon. In my Deku Tree video, I talked about the overall pacing of that game being good because it didn't make you do much in the way of what I called chores before the dungeon. I pointed out that other games, in particular Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, were pretty notorious for this, but I didn't mention Majora's Mask, despite the fact that there is a lot happening before the dungeon. The reason for that is because all of this stuff actually serves a purpose for propelling the story forward, whereas herding goats doesn't. The other thing to note here is that Majora's Mask has an overall very different structure from these other games, and so this change of pacing is better suited to this different structure. Okay, back to it. The game's focus on world building comes to full focus here, as we are basically given the 3 in-game days to explore all of Clocktown, meet all of its residents, and figure out how to get to Skull Kid. If you know what you're doing, this can be done pretty quickly. So for returning players who don't want to just stand around for 3 days waiting for the door to open, you can chill with the Scarecrow here to skip ahead through time. Just a quick mention about Clocktown. Just adding further to this impending doom feeling, you may notice how the music changes throughout the 3 days. During the first day, it has a very happy fairy tale vibe to it. During the second day, when it rains, the tempo increases to add a sense of urgency. And by the third day, there is this sinister undertone behind the song's happy vibe. It's genius, and I think it perfectly embodies the facade of optimism that many of the town folks put on while living in complete denial of their own impending doom. When we confront the Skull Kid at the top of the tower, he seems to be pretty apathetic to the whole destruction of the world thing that's going on here, until Tail, Tattle's brother, steps out of line to plead with us to bring the 4 here from the swamp, mountain, ocean, and canyon. Skull Kid smacks him aside, which further cements for Tattle just which side of the conflict she really belongs on. Skull Kid taunts us a bit, challenging us to stop the moon, which we can't do. We simply are not powerful enough. Instead, we need to shoot him to knock the ocarina out of his hand and quickly grab it. At this point, Link has a flashback of Zelda giving him the ocarina from before he left Hyrule and teaching him the Song of Time. Tattle gives us another hint as she cries out in desperation that we need more time if we're going to stop the Skull Kid. So since we just remembered it, we can play the Song of Time. Interestingly, the ocarina actually changes shape while in our possession to match whatever form we are in. So when we go to play it, we now have these Deku pipes. Weird, but cool. Playing the song will take us all the way back in time to the dawn of the first day. Everything sort of resets. Going back to see the mask salesman, he will live up to his promise. Since we got our ocarina back, he teaches us the Song of Healing, which transforms us back to our Hylian form, and the Deku mask is created, which we can use to transform back and forth into Deku form at any time. Great! However, we weren't yet able to get Majora's mask back yet for him, so he reminds us of what's at stake here. That mask is pure evil and contains some pretty scary dark magic. So we now have this new ability to transform, a world to save, and a vague idea of how to do it. Tattle knows Termina luckily and lets us know that the swamp is directly south of town, so that's a good starting point. Now before heading there, we can do some optional side content, especially because we can travel back in time at any point if we want. It's totally optional, but some that I recommend include getting the blast mask on the night of the first day, effectively negating the need to ever stock up on bombs, and the bunny hood on the third day, which increases your run speed and jump distance. It's also worth getting the Great Fairy Mask, which you'll see why soon. Anyways, heading south, we'll find the swamp, where the water is poisoned for some reason, meaning we need safe passage through the water to get to the dungeon. But the boat operator is missing. We can find her if we follow the path east and into these woods, where a monkey will ask you to follow him to where Kume is found. This is one of those cases of someone we know from Hyrule having a Terminian counterpart, but this version of Twinrova is definitely not evil, so don't worry. Kume was injured here, so we'll need to go to her sister Kotake's potion shop. Kotake will give you a bottle and red potion, which will heal Kume. Now Kume will be able to run the boat cruise, giving us safe passage through the swamp. These monkeys will accost us and ask for help because one of the monkeys was taken hostage by the Deku people, so we'll find ourselves at the Deku Palace. There's some sneaking around we'll need to do in order to find this bean salesman so that we can plant magic beans and get access to where the monkey is locked up. This part is really fun, using Deku Link to pop out of the flowers and navigate through here. Finally, we'll find the kidnapped monkey. He explains that he is imprisoned here because the Deku King thinks the monkey kidnapped his daughter. But actually what happened is that he had gone with the Deku Princess to investigate Woodfall Temple to find out why the water of the swamp was poisoned. The princess is now trapped there. He teaches us the Sonota of Awakening, which will give us access to the temple. Now we can head out of the palace, further up the main path, and up to Woodfall. Playing the song he taught us raises the temple out of the water. Phew, I know that was a lot, but now we can finally head into the game's first dungeon, Woodfall Temple. Supposedly, Woodfall Temple is a sacred place for the Deku people, which you can see in the general decor of the place with its Deku faces on these walls and pillars, and the leafy, flowery aesthetic that they have going on here. However, the place seems to have been cursed and is the source of the swamp's poison water. This dungeon will take full advantage of Link's Deku form in order to fly across obstacles and hop across the water without taking damage. There's a couple things to note about how Majora's Mask treats its dungeons as well. First of all, they follow a sort of formula in which they have an important central room, which is important not just for navigation, like we've seen in some of Ocarina of Time's dungeons, but also in which you will need to make a change to part of the actual dungeon itself. It also has dungeon items that are all connected or extensions of each other. Woodfall introduces us to this idea, easing us into the overall structure of the game's dungeons, but sparing no challenge at the same time. It's an impressive balance. This game also adds an extra wrinkle to the dungeon formula. There is an optional side objective of rescuing the stray fairies, with 15 to find in each dungeon, which will reward us with optional upgrades. This ends up being a nice incentive to explore the dungeon more thoroughly, and is the reason we need to have the Great Fairy Mask, which will glow if you're in the same room as a stray fairy that hasn't been found yet. It also draws the stray fairies towards you, making them much easier to collect. This place has such a creepy temple vibe going on here as well, by the way. First things first, the music. There's this weird chanting. This tribal feeling percussion. And a lot of just noise going on that makes it sound like there's always something more dangerous going on just around the corner. Again, I've said it many times, but I'm no expert on musical theory. I can only tell you how the music makes me feel and do my best to articulate that. But despite seeming quite simple at a glance, this track has a lot of layers to it, and that goes a long way to improving the atmosphere of the dungeon. Visually, they also capture this swamp dungeon atmosphere just right. In particular, the use of light, or lack thereof in certain areas, paired with these enemies called bows, not pose, give me the heebie-jeebies. And all of this over the backdrop of this stone brick temple that in my opinion is perfectly believable in the context of the story. The dungeon also provides plenty of balance between its overall navigational challenges that make up the larger picture of the dungeon, the smaller puzzles that help you progress through the individual rooms, and plenty of combat. When we first enter the dungeon's foyer, we'll right away have 2 stray fairies to collect. We'll have to use Deku Link's abilities to fly across this room. If you fall down, you'll quickly be swarmed by these guys. Heebie-jeebies, I tell ya. Make it across, and we'll be in the dungeon's central room. There's a platform in the middle of this room with an unlit torch, but it's entirely out of reach, so there isn't really a way to light it at this time. But based on its placement, it seems pretty important. There are technically quite a few doors in this room, but they're all either locked or inaccessible, except for this one at the bottom. You may notice how they intentionally make you walk past another locked door to get to it. The next room is this open rectangle room. There's more to do here later, but for now we'll need to open that chest to get a key and head into the next room. This room locks you in with a quick combat challenge against a handful of these enemies called snappers. The only way to damage them is actually from below, since they've got this turtle shell thing happening. So you'll need to go into the Deku flowers and pop out from beneath. You have to be pretty precise with the timing, so watch out for that. Already you can tell from the few enemies we've fought how much more challenging this dungeon is from the Deku tree. Anyhow, defeating these snappers will earn us the dungeon map. Off to a good start. Now that we have the map and a key, the only way that's accessible is to backtrack into the dungeon's central room, where we can spend that key on the locked door we walked past before, and move on into this bridge staircase room. There's a bit of a puzzle here in which you've got to push the block out of the way to make a path, but make sure to go around and push it again to create a shortcut, so that you can quickly run and use a stick to light the torch at the other end of the room. Lighting this torch will unlock the door immediately in front of us, so in we go. There's a second short combat challenge in which we'll have to kill these dragonflies, which aren't too tough. This will now earn us the compass. That was quick. Now we can head upstairs, but make sure to take another stick with you, which you can use to burn the web at the top of the room to open the path forward. This takes us up a flight of stairs and up to the second floor of the dungeon. This room at the top of the stairs is pitch black, and Tattle warns us that she senses a lot of evil here. The room is small, but honestly, that creepy factor is done really well with this setup. In the darkness, with that message, and then you're ambushed by more black bows with only their glow glowing eyes visible? Chills, guys, chills. There's a single torch lit in the center of the room after the hallway, so you'll want to use a stick once more to light all of these unlit torches to unlock the door. Simple enough. If you stay an extra moment to defeat all the enemies, however, it will reward us with a chest containing one of the stray fairies. Nice. The next room is a sort of obstacle course, building on the concept seen in the foyer, where we'll need to navigate using Deku Link to fly. However, this time around, the platforms are moving, and there's a couple of dragonfly enemies flying around the room, ready to knock you down. There's also holes in the floor, which will set you back as well, so careful where you fly. Otherwise, you can use Deku Link to shoot them down before flying through. The stairs at the end of the room take us back into the central room, but now on the second floor balcony, which we could not reach before. If you're concerned about backtracking being a hassle, there is also a switch you can press here, which will make a pair of ladders appear to connect this balcony down to the first floor. Tattle will draw our attention back to the middle platform with that unlit torch, which from this vantage point we can see a lit torch between our position and the unlit one. But still, we can't do anything with it just yet. From here there are 2 more doors we haven't gone through yet, but since one is locked, naturally we'll go through the other one. This pretty well parallels our path taken on the first floor, as it even brings us into the same first room as before, except as you'd expect on the second floor balcony. Follow along the balcony here and there's another door to go through. This next room is another combat challenge against a lone Dynalphos. This isn't something I ever thought about before starting this dungeon design series, but the fact that in the game's first dungeon we're fighting one of these guys just goes to show you how much this game means business. The only instances in Ocarina of Time where we fought a Dynalphos were in the optional Gerudo training grounds and Ganon's castle itself, the game's final dungeon. Even then, at that point we were so well equipped that they were hardly any challenge at all. Here, all we've got is the Kokiri sword, which is not that powerful. Fighting him is pretty well the same as fighting Lizalfos in Ocarina of Time, but the thing is that in that game you could use Link's crouch as kind of a crutch in the fight to block any of their attacks. Here, Link's shield actually fits his size, so we can't rely on that crouch. And even further, these guys have a pretty effective fire breathing attack that you can't even block. Even still, get a couple of jump attacks in there and you should be just fine taking him down. This fight rewards us with the dungeon item. The bow is one of the game's most important and effective items. Here in this dungeon, it's used in a pretty traditional Zelda way, but the game does build upon what Link is capable of doing with it, so I think keeping to its more established uses was a smart choice for the beginning. And yes, as expected, it's put to use right away. Back in the previous room, there is an eye switch we can shoot, pretty familiar territory, which will cause this platform with a Deku flower to rise up from the lower part of the room, which we already visited. It will continually raise and lower, meaning that if we fall by mistake, we're given a nice shortcut back up. But more importantly, it allows us to get across the room and into the next door. The next room takes us face to face with the dungeon's mid-boss, Gecko. He's a frog, not a gecko, but his name is Gecko. Just roll with it. At first he seems like almost no challenge at all, but then he summons a snapper to ride on. We've fought these guys already, so we know what to do. Get into the Deku flower and time it just right so you can pop up underneath him to strike his underbelly. This will do some damage and will cause Gecko to fall off of his mount here. He'll be pretty evasive, crawling around the ceiling, so you'll want to use your newly acquired bow to shoot him down. Just a word of advice, in my experience, he moves too quickly to effectively hit him using Z targeting, so I find it much less wasteful to aim manually, but that's just me. Either way, if you miss a bunch, he will drop arrows when you defeat him, so the concern of running out is pretty well nullified. After a few good shots, he will be defeated and turned into a normal frog. Remember that for later. This fight rewards us with the boss key. Thanks to the dungeon's smart layout, it's a very short backtrack into the central room, where we can now use the bow to finally light that torch in the middle of the room, which purifies the water in the temple. The platform also raises up and starts rotating, so we can now use the central torch to light the second unlit torch across the room, which unlocks the final door. This puzzle feels to me like an evolution of a similar idea from way back in Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple. Side note, there's a button you can press beside that torch to make a treasure chest appear and get another stray fairy. Okay, through that last door, which we just unlocked, is one final room to tackle. Though if you want to quickly backtrack, grab any stray fairies that you missed, this is a good time to do that. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in this room with all of these alcoves. The room's layout seems more daunting than it really is. There's a switch we can shoot with the bow to extinguish these flames, and then we'll need to use the Deku flowers to fly across the room and over to the door. Pretty straightforward on paper. Just make sure to not miss those last few straight fairies in this room. It's also worth using the bow to shoot down all of the enemies in here before flying across, in order to avoid getting attacked in midair. Alright, a successful landing will take us to the boss door, where we can confront the dungeon's final challenge. The game wastes no time here. As soon as you enter the room, the dungeon boss, Odolwa, drops from the ceiling and initiates the battle. Odolwa seems to be a giant tribal warrior of some kind. I've heard people draw comparisons to his design with traditional South American cultures, but I can't even begin to comment on that. As far as Zelda bosses go, he is a really neat change of pace though. He isn't really a giant monster, he's humanoid, and the sense of scale here rivals that of Ganon himself. The fight is also a great shakeup because it breaks from Ocarina of Time's established formula in that you don't have to use the dungeon item whatsoever. You can use the bow to stun him, but it's just as effective to rush him with your sword. Now of course, I am playing the original N64 version, and the 3DS remake does change some parts of this fight to make it more accessible. But I always felt like just putting a giant eyeball weak spot on him was kind of a betrayal of what made this fight good. This isn't a traditional Zelda boss, but instead it's two warriors with swords locked in a duel. So trying to change what makes him unique in order to better fit the mold of Zelda bosses is just a letdown in my opinion. Odolwa also has a lot of personality compared to most bosses, since he doesn't fall under the big monster category. He chants and dances around the room, which opens him up to attack. He doesn't pack too heavy of a punch. When he hits you, it's more spectacle than actual threat, as he knocks you a decent way back, but only deals a quarter of a heart in damage. I can forgive that, with him being the first boss in the game after all. After a few good hits, he'll call for backup, causing these little bugs to fall from the ceiling and attack you. But honestly, they are basically no threat at all. You can kill them for hearts if you need, but otherwise you can pretty well ignore them and try to go in for the finishing blow. A couple good jump attacks, and Odolwa will be defeated. Don't forget the heart container, and you can recover Odolwa's remains. Instead of being warped outside, we appear in this ethereal place, face to face with one of the 4 giants, who is now freed thanks to our efforts here. This part is so surreal, and the music here has the perfect amount of emotional weight to it. It's sincerely wonderful. You'll learn the song Oath to Order, but with no idea what it's for other than to call them. Last thing to go over, you'll now find the Deku Princess here, so you can bring her home so that she can beat up her dad and free the monkey. Looks like all is well in the swamp, now that the water is no longer poisoned. Don't forget to bring home those stray fairies as well to get the upgraded spin attack, which even works with the quick spin, so it's super useful in my opinion. So that's the dungeon. Overall, there's a lot to talk about here. This game has way more of a fleshed out introduction than the previous game, but if I had to sum it up, an ongoing feeling that we're going to be seeing throughout this game is dread. There's dread of the moon falling, dread the Deku Princess is in trouble, dread the monkey is going to be executed, dread that Link is cursed, dread that time is running out with a literal countdown at the bottom of your screen at all times, and plenty more that we'll see as we cover the other areas of the game. But coupled with that dread is relief. As you work to save all of these people, the tension releases as the monkey is freed, the poison disappears, and as the Deku Princess is reunited with her family. The dungeon itself is a great starter dungeon. You can tell from how much more complicated the design is here, even in the navigational aspect, that they really wanted to keep things fresh and challenging for players who have already played and beaten Ocarina of Time, rather than just a repeat of that experience. It also really cements the idea of switching back and forth between Link's Deku and Hylian forms, as both are used for many of the dungeon's puzzles, and though Deku Link is not nearly as effective in combat since you don't get to use a sword or bow, they still found a way to tie his abilities into at least the mid-boss battle. A couple nitpicks which feel really minor. These moths, they are the worst. They chase and attack you if you're holding a lit Deku stick. It's just a nuisance. I also feel like the boss battle could have found a way to make using the Deku form more useful. They did try to fix that in the 3DS version, but not very well in my opinion. That said, I usually just stick to Link's Hylian form for the entire battle. Even still though, I think the Deku mask gets more than enough utilization throughout the rest of the dungeon, and that the boss fight is unique enough for it to not be held back because of this. Overall, the game has done a great job setting up its pacing, its formula, and its mechanics, and Woodfall Temple plays a big part in that. I like it a lot. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for when the next one comes out. I also just wanted to say a quick thanks to those who supported me on Patreon, particularly those who supported at the cheese tier or higher, which includes Brenda, Tetra, Callie, and Finley. Thank you so much again, you guys, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye!